Queen Margot is one of the most famous women in history, largely due to Alexandre Dumas' renowned novel and its equally celebrated film adaptations. However, the real woman behind the fictional heroine was quite different. The name Queen Margot was rarely used in her lifetime. It appears only a couple of times in the memoirs of her brother, King Charles IX. In truth, her name was Marguerite de Valois, the last direct descendant of the Valois dynasty, which ruled France from 1328. As the king's sister, her formal title was Madame. Upon her marriage, she became Queen of Navarre, and after her divorce from Henry IV, she was known as Queen Marguerite, Duchess of Valois. Margot, her friend the Duchess of Nevers, and Coconus's mistress, allegedly retrieved the severed heads, embalmed them, and appeared the next day dressed in mourning, cradling the skulls. It is believed the heads of La Mole and Coconus were later discovered in an abbey, their mouths filled with jewels. Did Marguerite also save her husband's life during the massacre? She never gave a direct answer to that question, only noting in her memoirs that she refused to discuss her divorce from the King of Navarre, which took place months later against her family's wishes. Another valuable testimony comes from a well-informed man, Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to Louis XIII and a character well known from Dumas's The Three Musketeers. He knew Marguerite personally and praised her in his memoirs, calling her the most famous queen of her era. If the wedding of Henry and Marguerite was a national horror for France, it was no less a personal tragedy for her. Her husband faced mortal danger, and there were debates about whether to kill him. In 1582, Margot wrote to Henry of Navarre, "I have always put my life on the line to make sure nothing ever happened to you." After the massacre, both Henry of Navarre and Marguerite remained hostages in the Louvre. Their relationship astonished even their contemporaries. Marguerite frankly admitted in her memoirs that she saw Henry more as a brother than a husband, and he felt the same toward her. Still, that didn't prevent them from living as husband and wife, complete with jealousy and mutual accusations. It is also known that Queen Marguerite dreamed of bearing her husband's child, something she even wrote about to her mother. But then, another man entered her life, seemingly becoming her greatest love, another character from one of Dumas's novels. Yes, it was him, the very same, though contrary to Alexandre Dumas's portrayal of Bussy as a chivalrous knight without fear or reproach, the real Count was likely far less noble. On the night of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, he murdered 7 of his own cousins in a calculated bid for their estates and lands, later claiming they had all been Huguenots. Marguerite and Bussy met at the coronation of Henry III, and their love ignited instantly. Surviving verses dedicated to Marguerite read, "My life is like a dark night if it lacks the light of your love." Marguerite returned Bussy's affection with full intensity, so much so that even the usually tolerant Henry of Navarre began to show signs of jealousy. Yet the political intrigue that surrounded the Valois family and their circle forced Bussy to part from Marguerite. He had to leave Paris alongside the Duke of Anjou. Bussy's death remains shrouded in mystery. What is known is that he was lured into a trap by the Countess de Montsoreau at her husband's behest, with involvement from the king and the Duke of Anjou. Unlike the romanticized tale in La Dame de Montsoreau, Bussy's death had political motives, not romantic ones. About 20 men ambushed him with brutal preparation, and this time there was no miraculous escape. Henry of Navarre eventually escaped from Paris in 1576. The king kept Marguerite in the capital as a hostage, suspecting she had helped facilitate her husband's flight. She was able to rejoin him only in 1578, when the Huguenots and Catholics negotiated a temporary peace. Marguerite considered her first stay at the Navarrese court to be one of the happiest periods of her life. Even far from Paris, the refined queen could not live without books, poets, philosophers, grand balls, and festivities. While in Navarre, she experienced another love affair, this time with a courtier of her younger brother François, the Marquis de Champvallon. Alongside Bussy, Chauvelin is mentioned often in her memoirs as one of her only confirmed lovers. In February 1582, she left for Paris to follow her younger brother. There, her relationship with Chauvelin became public knowledge, sparking the king's outrage. He even suspected that his sister had borne a child by the Marquis and ordered her back to her husband in Gascony. Her lover quickly abandoned the queen, marrying advantageously. Marguerite was devastated by his betrayal. In August 1583, without ceremony and accompanied by only a small entourage, she set off back to Navarre, where no one was awaiting her. Henry of Navarre intercepted her on the road and made her wait for the outcome of negotiations with Henry III. He demanded compensation for receiving Marguerite. The humiliating discussions and the delay lasted 7 months. In a letter from this time, she wrote, "My life now resembles that of a slave. I submit to the power and will of one I cannot resist." She finally returned to Navarre, only to find that she was unwanted. Her husband had begun a new romance with the famous courtesan Diane d'Andoin, known as La Belle Corisande. Once again, he was wholly absorbed by love, then war, then love again. Henry of Navarre was famously amorous. Some meticulous historians estimate that the number of his lovers approached 50. Marguerite was born into the royal family of King Henry II of France and his wife Catherine de' Medici. As a young girl, she was remarkably intelligent. By the age of 16, she had mastered several languages, including Latin and Greek, and could read Homer in the original. She played music and studied philosophy, mathematics, and anatomy. Though DUMAS and many biographers described her as a striking brunette, portraits often show a clear blonde. This apparent contradiction is due to Marguerite sometimes wearing fashionable curly blonde wigs for her portraits. In June 1584, Marguerite's beloved brother, François, Duke of Alençon and Anjou, died at the age of 30. He had never married and was the heir to the French throne. During his lifetime, Marguerite had still held out hope that her husband might find her politically useful again as an intermediary with her brother. But François' death made Henry of Bourbon the new heir to the French crown. No longer needing Marguerite's diplomatic connections, Henry chose to negotiate directly with the royal court. Still, at the time, no one could imagine a Protestant Huguenot as the future king of France, least of all the Catholics, led by the powerful Guise family. The Guises re-established the Catholic League and allied themselves with Spain, challenging both the French king and the King of Navarre. This marked the start of the 8th and final French Civil War, also known as the War of the Three Henrys: Henry of Bourbon, Henry of Guise, and Henry III. At stake was the highest prize, the French crown. For the first time in her generally obedient life, Marguerite de Valois took a stand in a war. Betrayed by everyone, including her husband, she opened correspondence with leaders of the Catholic League and even with Philip II of Spain. In May 1585, she officially declared her allegiance to the League. Marguerite defied both her brother, the king, and her husband by leaving Navarre and heading to the city of Agen to join their enemies. Her wounded pride drove her to seek revenge with her new allies. In Agen, she demonstrated unexpected military prowess, personally overseeing the fortification of the city. However, the townspeople, unwilling to side with the Catholic League, revolted and surrendered the city to royal forces. The collapse of the opposition resulted in Marguerite's capture. Escorted by guards, she was transported as a prisoner to her own castle in Usen. Her imprisonment gave her relatives the opportunity to determine her fate. Henry of Navarre wished to arrange a divorce, while Queen Mother Catherine de' Medici proposed sending her daughter to a convent and marrying her niece, Christina of Lorraine, to the King of France. Yet despite his strict treatment of his sister, the king did not give up hope of reconciling her with her husband and producing an heir, and thus did not support their mother's harsh plan. Marguerite remained a political prisoner until February 1587. Then, after receiving money and titles from the king, the castle commander switched sides to the Guises and Philip II. The Swiss guards swore allegiance to Marguerite, and she became the sovereign lady of the impregnable castle of Usen. At Usen, Marguerite gave herself over completely to reading and writing. There, she authored her memoirs, the first female-written memoirs in the history of French literature. In the castle, she ruled as she pleased and lived an eventful life, such that Usen became known as the Castle of Unfading Love. The great love of her later years, the Duke of Guise, who had ensured her safety in Usen, died in 1588. Marguerite remained at the castle for 19 years, never leaving. She officially became Queen of France when her husband converted to Catholicism and was crowned. Since she had borne him no children, their marriage had lost its political value. Divorce negotiations began, and in 1599 they were finalized. A royal decree allowed her to retain the title Queen of Navarre and granted her the new title Queen of France. She also gained the right to use lands in southwestern France, gifted by her brothers, received a generous pension, and was permitted to return to Paris. There, she acquired properties and built a residence opposite the Louvre, where she would spend the final 7 years of her life. Henry IV, now ruling for political advantage, married Marie de Medici, niece of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinando I. Remarkably, Marguerite and Marie maintained friendly relations. Their preserved correspondence reveals polite and respectful communication. When Henry and his new wife began having children, Marguerite warmly congratulated him. Was she a beauty? Reports suggest she resembled her mother, with a soft facial structure and slightly drooping cheeks, and similarly shaped eyebrows. Yet contemporaries highly praised her appearance. Her white, satin-like skin and voluptuous figure were especially admired. A diplomat at the French court once remarked, "To attend court without seeing Marguerite de Valois is to miss France and its very heart." But the king's newfound family life and reform plans were cut short. In 1610, he was assassinated by the fanatic François Ravaillac. The king's death compelled Marguerite to fight once more for peace in France. Confident in her ability to shape the future, Marguerite de Valois devoted herself to securing the throne for a new dynasty through the young Louis XIII. This is yet another remarkable detail in the portrait of Marguerite, a strong and extraordinary woman. Not only did she find the strength to accept her former husband's new marriage, but she also formed a bond with his son, who would later become none other than Louis XIII, known from the Three Musketeers. The young king had a strained and difficult relationship with his own mother, Marie de Medici, which left him feeling isolated. Marguerite, in contrast, became the only person who truly cared for him. The boy adored his stepmother, kind-hearted Marguerite. She gave him toys, told him fairy tales, and showered him with affection. In fact, it was to the son of her former husband that Marguerite left her entire estate. The years had changed the once beautiful queen. Marguerite had become a stout, elderly woman, but the mischievous glint in her dark eyes and her fondness for lavish, old-fashioned gowns still sparked smiles at court. Betraying the charm of the once celebrated beauty, she remained generous to anyone in need. Marguerite died in 1615 of a severe chill. She had frozen during a long stay in the icy hall of the Palais du Petit Bourbon. Life was far from easy for Marguerite. She was only 6 when her father died. Her elder brother, Francis II, reigned for just a year before his death. The next king, Charles Lamine, was a minor, and the true ruler of France became their formidable mother, Catherine de Medici, a ruthless schemer who stopped at nothing to achieve her goals. It was she who arranged Marguerite's marriage to Henry of Navarre, the son of the slain leader of the Huguenots, even though Catherine herself was a fervent Catholic and despised the Huguenots. Marguerite was not pleased with this arrangement. She was deeply in love with the handsome Duke of Henry de Guise, who returned her affections. Their passionate affair was widely known, though there is no definitive evidence of physical intimacy. Years later, Marguerite painted an unflattering picture of Guise in her memoirs, perhaps understandable, as she wrote them during the reign of Henry IV. She may not have wished to reveal one of her most intimate secrets. Only one letter from their correspondence survives, in which she wrote, "I shall ceaselessly pray to the Lord, as I always have, beseeching him to grant you luck and glory. All good people wish you well, and I more than anyone express my eternal loyalty and love." Despite her feelings, Marguerite married Henry of Navarre on August 18, 1572. But rather than happily ever after, they were immediately plunged into the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a brutal slaughter of Huguenots that began just days after their wedding. On the night of August 24th, a wave of violence swept through Paris, even reaching the Royal Louvre Palace. By various estimates, between 3,000 and 10,000 Huguenots were killed in those bloody days. Interestingly, Marguerite de Valois' memoirs contain one of the few authentic descriptions of that horrific night from the perspective of those inside the Louvre. In her account, there is a striking detail. She suspected that her mother, Catherine de' Medici, deliberately excluded her from the bloody scheme, possibly hoping that her daughter would be killed. The death of the Queen of Navarre, the French king's sister, at the hands of the enraged Huguenots could have served as a powerful justification for the massacre in the eyes of the royal family. Fortunately, Marguerite miraculously survived and even managed to save the lives of at least 3 noblemen, one of whom, covered in blood, collapsed at her feet in her bedchamber. Those familiar with the legend of Queen Margot might assume this was La Mole, the Huguenot whom Margot saves during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, but they would be mistaken. The real La Mole was not a Huguenot, and their romance began much later. The story of the mysterious man whom Marguerite rescued in her bedroom first came to light through her memoirs, published in Paris in 1628. Other witnesses claimed that Marguerite saved several people, including a nobleman named Laurent, who was gravely wounded and threw himself onto her bed as she slept. She reportedly chased away his pursuers all the way to the door. So it was Laurent, not La Mole. Margot's love affair with the real La Mole began 10 months after her wedding to Henry of Navarre. She was 20 and La Mole was 44, but he was said to be devilishly charming, more skilled in the arts of Venus than of Mars, as contemporaries joked. In truth, La Mole was a devout Catholic. He and his friend Cocona were accused of conspiring against the king. The allegations also implicated Henry of Navarre and Prince François, Margot's brother. The conspirators were arrested, but as expected, those without royal names like Valois or Bourbon paid the highest price. Before his execution, La Mole whispered, "Lord, Holy Virgin Mary, have mercy on me. I entrust myself to the prayers of the Queen of Navarre and other noble ladies."